The people who embarrass you in public rarely expect someone powerful to remember your name afterward. I used to believe humiliation faded with time. I was wrong. It lingers in the way your hands shake when a room suddenly goes quiet, in the way your heartbeat becomes louder than the music surrounding you, and in the way strangers avoid your eyes because looking at you would mean admitting they witnessed something they should have stopped. The Grand Regent Hotel glittered beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected 1,000 tiny lights across polished marble floors. Every glass sparkled. Every smile looked expensive. Every guest carried themselves as though the world had already agreed they mattered. I adjusted the silver name badge pinned neatly to my navy blazer and reminded myself that professionalism was stronger than nerves. 26 years old, born and raised outside Columbus, Ohio, and somehow I had worked my way into managing hospitality for one of Manhattan's most exclusive charity galas. My parents still called every Sunday to ask if I was eating enough. My younger brother joked that I spent more time serving billionaires than sleeping. Maybe he wasn't wrong. The evening had unfolded almost perfectly. Senators laughed beside entrepreneurs. Celebrity donors posed beneath flashing cameras. A string quartet filled the ballroom with soft music that floated through conversations like warm air before autumn arrived. Everything looked effortless because people like me spent weeks making sure no one noticed the work behind perfection. Then the silence came. It happened so quickly that I almost missed the reason. A champagne flute slipped from a guest's hand and shattered near the auction stage. I stepped forward automatically, apologizing with the practiced calm every luxury employee learned before their first promotion. I offered another glass before anyone could complain. Instead of accepting it, the guest smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. His voice wasn't loud, but somehow everyone heard it. Maybe next time hire someone who belongs in a place like this. A few nervous laughs floated across the ballroom. Someone looked away. Someone pretended to check a phone. Another guest quietly stepped backward as if embarrassment could spread like smoke. Heat rushed into my face. I wanted to answer. I wanted to defend myself. Instead, years of customer service settled onto my shoulders like invisible armor. I lowered my eyes just enough to remain respectful without surrendering my dignity. "I'm sorry your evening was interrupted, sir," I said softly. "I'll make sure everything is taken care of." He chuckled before turning back toward his companions, already finished with me because people like him believed the story ended the moment they walked away. But mine didn't. As I knelt to gather the broken glass, I became aware of something impossible to ignore. Someone was watching me. Not with amusement. Not with pity. With complete, unwavering attention. I slowly looked toward the far side of the ballroom where the city's most influential guests occupied a private section overlooking the stage. He sat alone while conversations flowed around him. Black tailored suit. Dark hair brushed neatly away from a calm face. Steel blue eyes that revealed nothing and somehow noticed everything. Ethan Calloway didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rescue me. He simply held my gaze for one quiet second that felt longer than the entire evening, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I had the overwhelming feeling that the most important moment of my life had just begun. I finished the rest of the evening exactly the way I had started it, carrying trays, answering questions, smiling on command, and pretending that nothing inside me had cracked. That was the strange thing about luxury hotels. Feelings were invisible as long as the service remained flawless. By the time the final guests drifted toward the exits, the ballroom looked almost untouched, as though the humiliation that had unfolded beneath those chandeliers had existed only inside my memory. I supervised the cleanup crew, checked inventory twice, signed 3 closing reports, and thanked every employee before they clocked out. Routine had always been my safest place. If I kept moving, I did not have to think. Claire. My assistant, Megan, approached with hesitant steps, clutching her tablet against her chest. "Are you all right?" I forced the same smile I had worn all night. "I am fine." She looked unconvinced. "You did not deserve that." I glanced across the now quiet ballroom where workers carefully folded white tablecloths and lowered floral arrangements into storage carts. It is over. No, she whispered. Everyone saw it. Her words landed harder than the insult itself because they were true. Public embarrassment never belonged only to the moment. It followed you into every conversation afterward. Every sympathetic glance reminded you that people remembered. I slipped my blazer over my shoulders and reached for my purse. Go home, Megan. Get some sleep. She hugged me before I could stop her. It was quick, awkward, and sincere. You are stronger than they are. I smiled again, but this time it felt real. Outside, Manhattan shimmered beneath cool spring air. Yellow taxis rolled past in endless streams while distant sirens blended into the city's familiar soundtrack. I usually loved walking the 6 blocks to my apartment after major events. It helped clear my mind. Tonight every reflection in every storefront reminded me of the ballroom. I kept hearing that man's voice. Maybe next time hire someone who belongs here. I had worked 12 years to belong here. Community college. Scholarships. Overnight hotel shifts. Management certifications. Endless weekends while everyone else celebrated holidays. Belonging had never been given to me. I had earned every inch of it. My phone vibrated just as I reached the corner of Lexington Avenue. I expected my mother checking whether I had made it home. Instead, there was no caller identification. No message. Just a single photograph. It showed me kneeling beside the broken champagne glass from earlier that evening. The angle was impossible. Whoever had taken it had been standing far across the ballroom. Attached beneath the image was one sentence. You kept your dignity when everyone else lost theirs. I stopped walking. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Somehow that unsettled me even more. There was no threat. No signature. No explanation. Only those 11 words. A black sedan waited across the street beneath a streetlight. The windows were dark, hiding whoever sat inside. It remained parked for several seconds before pulling smoothly into traffic without rushing, without hesitation, disappearing among hundreds of identical headlights until I could no longer tell which car had been watching me. I looked down at my phone one more time. The message was still there. So was the photograph. For reasons I could not explain, I thought about the man with the steel blue eyes sitting alone at the back of the ballroom. Ethan Calloway had never spoken a single word to me, yet somehow I knew the quiet part of my evening was only beginning. I stared at the message for almost a full minute before slipping my phone into my purse. Any sensible person would have blocked the number, reported it, or convinced themselves it was nothing more than an overly observant guest. I tried all 3 explanations during the subway ride home. None of them felt true. My apartment overlooked a narrow street on the Upper East Side where the buildings stood close enough that neighbors occasionally waved from opposite windows. It was small, barely 600 square feet, but every piece of furniture had been chosen by me, paid for by me, and carried upstairs one exhausting trip at a time. It was the first place that had ever truly belonged to me. I kicked off my heels, poured a glass of water, and finally opened the message again. The photograph was clear enough to capture every detail. My hands gathering broken glass. My shoulders squared instead of slumped. My face calm despite everything I had been feeling. Whoever had taken it had not focused on the man who embarrassed me. They had focused on me. Another notification appeared before I could decide what to do. My pulse quickened. It was another message from the same unknown number. There were only 6 words this time. Sleep peacefully. Tomorrow will be different. I frowned. Different how? I typed a reply before deleting it. Then I typed another one and erased that too. Curiosity was dangerous. My father had always warned me that unanswered questions sometimes protected people better than answered ones. I turned the phone face down on the kitchen counter and forced myself into my usual routine. Shower. Chamomile tea. Read 20 pages of a novel. Lights out before midnight. The routine failed. Sleep arrived in fragments, interrupted by memories of polished marble floors and quiet laughter that had not belonged in a room full of successful adults. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds just after 7. New York looked completely ordinary again. Delivery trucks blocked traffic. Joggers crossed intersections without making eye contact. Coffee shops overflowed with commuters chasing another busy day. The world had already forgotten last night. I wished I could do the same. By 8:30 I was back at the Grand Regent Hotel reviewing schedules with department supervisors. No one mentioned the gala directly, but conversations felt unusually careful around me. They smiled a little longer. They apologized more often than necessary. Sympathy had a way of becoming its own uncomfortable spotlight. Around 10, my general manager stepped out of his office carrying a slim black envelope. "Claire," he called. "This was delivered by private courier about 20 minutes ago." I accepted it cautiously. Thick paper. No return address. My name embossed in silver lettering across the front. "Do you know who sent it?" He shook his head. "The courier only said it was important." My coworkers tried not to stare, but I felt their curiosity following me as I carried the envelope into my office and quietly closed the door. For several seconds I simply looked at it resting on my desk. Then I slid one finger beneath the seal and opened it carefully. Inside rested a single ivory card with elegant handwriting across the center. It read, "I keep every promise that deserves to be made." Beneath the sentence was only one name. Ethan Calloway. I had never spoken to him. I had never introduced myself. Yet somehow the signature felt less like the beginning of a conversation and more like the continuation of one that had started the moment our eyes met across that silent ballroom. For the next hour I tried to convince myself that the card meant nothing beyond courtesy from an influential guest. Hotels survived because relationships mattered. Wealthy donors thanked executives. Executives thanked sponsors. Occasionally someone thanked the staff. Maybe Ethan Calloway simply preferred expensive stationery over ordinary email. The explanation sounded reasonable until I noticed my hands refusing to file the card away. Something about those words refused to fit inside the normal world I understood. I placed the ivory card inside my desk drawer and buried it beneath event contracts before forcing my attention back to work. Conference schedules needed approval. A bridal reception had changed its seating chart for the 3rd time. The executive chef wanted additional staffing for a charity luncheon. Numbers, timelines, and checklists steadied my breathing again. By late afternoon I almost believed the strange messages belonged to yesterday instead of today. Then my office phone rang. Claire Bennett speaking. "Miss Bennett." The voice was calm, polished, and unfamiliar. "Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Brooks. I represent Mr. Ethan Calloway." My fingers tightened around the receiver. "How may I help you?" "Mr. Calloway would appreciate 10 minutes of your time this evening." 7 o'clock. The Westbridge Conservatory. I frowned. "I am sorry, but I do not schedule private meetings with hotel guests." There was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable. Simply patient. "He expected you to say that." "Did he?" "Yes, ma'am." The man sounded almost amused. "He asked me to tell you that this meeting is entirely your choice. No obligations. No expectations. If you decide not to come, no one will contact you again." I looked through my office window at employees crossing the lobby below. Life continued exactly as it always had. Why does Mr. Calloway want to meet me? He believes some conversations should happen face to face. About what? That is for him to explain. Before I could ask another question, the caller added quietly, "Whether you attend or not, Miss Bennett, he asked me to remind you that your dignity was never the problem." The line disconnected. I remained motionless, the receiver still pressed against my ear long after the dial tone returned. Those last words echoed louder than the conversation itself. Your dignity was never the problem. No one had said anything like that yesterday. Everyone else had offered sympathy. Ethan, somehow, had offered certainty. At 6:30 I stood in front of my apartment mirror debating with myself. Going felt reckless. Staying home felt impossible. I finally chose a simple cream blouse, navy slacks, and the same low heels I wore to work every day. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that suggested this was anything except a conversation. The Westbridge Conservatory overlooked the Hudson River, its glass walls reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun. Families wandered through the gardens while musicians performed softly near the fountain. It was peaceful enough to dissolve most of my anxiety. Almost. I spotted him before he noticed me. Ethan Calloway stood alone beside a row of white roses, one hand resting lightly on the stone railing as he watched the river flow beneath the evening sky. No security crowded around him. No dramatic entrance announced his presence. He looked less like one of the most influential men in New York and more like someone carrying thoughts too heavy to share. As though sensing me without turning, he spoke in a steady voice that carried across the quiet garden. "Thank you for coming, Claire." I stopped several feet away. "You already know my name," I replied carefully. Only then did he turn toward me, his steel blue eyes calm, unreadable, and somehow unexpectedly kind. I made sure I learned it the moment everyone else forgot to use it. For a moment neither of us spoke. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh roses across the conservatory while sunlight faded into shades of amber behind the Manhattan skyline. I had expected confidence from a man like Ethan Calloway. I had expected authority. What I had not expected was patience. He waited as though silence deserved as much respect as conversation. "You wanted to see me," I finally said. "I am here. Please tell me why." He nodded once before gesturing toward a quiet stone bench overlooking the river. "Only if you are comfortable." The choice surprised me. Most powerful people were accustomed to giving instructions, not offering options. I remained standing. "I would rather stay here." "That is perfectly fine." His answer came without the slightest hint of disappointment. He slipped one hand into the pocket of his tailored coat and looked toward the water before speaking again. "The man who spoke to you at the gala has embarrassed many people over the years." I folded my arms instinctively. Then I was not special. "No," Ethan said quietly. "You were simply the first person who refused to let him take your dignity." I frowned. "You make it sound as though I did something extraordinary." "You did." I shook my head. "I cleaned broken glass because it was my job." "No." His eyes met mine again. "You chose grace when anger would have been easier." Most people confuse silence with weakness. They do not understand that self-control often requires more strength than shouting. His words unsettled me because they echoed thoughts I had never shared with anyone. I looked away first. "Why does any of this matter to you?" He did not answer immediately. Instead he reached into his coat and removed a small velvet box. My breath caught before reason returned. The box was not opened. He simply placed it on the stone railing between us. "Please," I said carefully. "If this is a gift, I cannot accept it." "It is not a gift." "Then what is it?" "A reminder." He opened the box slowly. Inside rested a simple silver hotel name badge. Mine. The one I had assumed was lost during the gala. I stared at it in disbelief. "How did you find this?" "Someone stepped on it after you walked away." He closed the lid again. I picked it up. I accepted the small box with hesitant fingers, surprised by how much relief I felt seeing something so ordinary return to me. "Thank you," I whispered. "You are welcome." Another quiet moment settled between us before Ethan spoke with calm certainty. "Claire, I am not asking for your trust tonight. Trust cannot be requested. It has to be earned." His voice remained steady, almost gentle. "But there is one thing I want you to remember." He stepped back, leaving enough space that I never felt cornered. From this evening forward, no one will ever humiliate you again without discovering that respect has a cost they cannot afford. I searched his face for arrogance, for anger, for anything that would explain such confidence. I found neither. There was only conviction, spoken without raising his voice. "Is that a promise?" I asked softly. Ethan held my gaze as the last light of day disappeared beyond the river. "It is the only kind of promise I ever allow myself to make." The following week unfolded with the strange rhythm of ordinary days hiding extraordinary changes. Nothing dramatic happened in front of me. No public confrontations. No mysterious headlines announcing spectacular scandals. Life at the Grand Regent Hotel continued exactly as it always had. Bride still worried about flowers. Executives still argued over seating charts. Guests still complained when coffee arrived 30 seconds later than expected. Yet beneath that familiar routine, something invisible had begun to shift. I first noticed it on Tuesday morning while reviewing reservations in my office. Megan rushed in carrying her tablet, her eyes unusually wide. "Do you remember the man from the gala?" she asked quietly. I looked up from my paperwork. "Which one?" "The guest who embarrassed you." My stomach tightened. "What about him?" She hesitated before answering. "His company cancelled every event they had booked with us this year." I shrugged lightly. "Maybe they changed venues." "That is what I thought too. But then I heard something else." She lowered her voice even further. 3 other hotels said the same thing happened. Corporate meetings. Charity dinners. Luxury conferences. Everything disappeared overnight. I frowned. Successful businessmen did not simply erase entire calendars without reason. By Wednesday, another rumor spread through the hospitality industry. A prestigious investment firm quietly removed his name from its keynote speaker list. On Thursday, an exclusive private club postponed his membership renewal for reasons no one seemed willing to explain. Friday morning, an event planner I had known for years called simply to ask whether I had heard the news. "It is unbelievable," she whispered. "People who spent years trying to impress him suddenly cannot return his calls." I leaned back in my chair, staring through the window at the busy avenue below. New York never stopped moving, but reputations certainly could. I remembered Ethan's calm voice beside the river. "Respect has a cost they cannot afford." Until that moment I had assumed those words were symbolic, something meant to comfort me after a painful evening. Now I was no longer certain. Late that afternoon I stopped by the hotel cafe before heading upstairs. The television mounted above the espresso bar carried a business news channel. A reporter discussed changing leadership within several luxury investment partnerships. There was no mention of me. No mention of the gala. Only careful language about confidence, reputation, and strategic decisions. Customers continued drinking coffee without paying much attention. But I could not stop listening. "Claire?" The voice belonged to my general manager. "Everything all right?" I forced a smile. "Yes. Just distracted." He handed me a folder containing next month's event schedule. "Interesting week, huh?" "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Funny how quickly influential people can become ordinary when enough doors quietly close." His words stayed with me all evening. That night, sitting alone in my apartment with the silver name badge Ethan had returned resting beside my teacup, I replayed every conversation we had shared. He had never threatened anyone. He had never promised revenge. He had only promised that no one would humiliate me again. Somehow that promise was unfolding without noise, without spectacle, and without asking anything from me in return. I looked toward the city lights outside my window and realized something that unsettled me even more than the anonymous messages ever had. For the first time since the gala, I was no longer wondering whether Ethan Calloway could keep his promise. I was beginning to wonder what it might cost him to do it. By the beginning of the second week, coincidence no longer felt like a believable explanation. Every conversation I overheard seemed to circle back to the same name without anyone realizing I was listening more carefully than usual. Vendors mentioned delayed negotiations. Hotel executives quietly discussed replacing long-standing business partners. Even the concierge, who normally cared only about dinner reservations and Broadway tickets, casually remarked that one particular guest had suddenly become much less popular among New York's elite. I never asked questions. The answers were finding me anyway. Friday afternoon, after another 12-hour shift, I stepped into the employee parking garage carrying a folder filled with event proposals that I intended to review over the weekend. The concrete structure echoed with footsteps and distant engines. I unlocked my car, placed the folder on the passenger seat, and noticed a folded envelope tucked beneath my windshield wiper. My first instinct was irritation. Another advertisement. Another restaurant promotion. Instead, my name appeared across the front in neat handwriting. Claire. Nothing else. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single handwritten note. I hope you are sleeping better. That was all. No signature. No explanation. Yet I already knew who had written it. Most people asked whether you were doing well because they expected an answer. Ethan somehow managed to ask without demanding anything in return. I smiled despite myself before catching the expression in the reflection of my windshield. That smile disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. This had gone far enough. I folded the note, slipped it into my purse, and drove straight toward the Westbridge Conservatory instead of home. The gardens were quieter than the first evening we had met. Families had already left. Only a few visitors wandered among the flower paths while gardeners watered roses beneath the fading light. Ethan stood near the same stone railing overlooking the Hudson River, dressed in another perfectly tailored dark suit that somehow looked less formal surrounded by blooming flowers. He noticed me immediately but did not approach. He simply waited until I chose to walk the remaining distance myself. You knew I would come, I said before offering any greeting. I hoped, he answered calmly. I held up the folded note. This has to stop. His expression remained unchanged. The notes? Everything. My voice was steadier than I expected. The messages. The attention. Whatever is happening to that man from the gala. If you are responsible, I do not want this. Ethan studied my face for several quiet seconds before speaking. You believe I am punishing him. Are you not? No. His answer came without hesitation. People make their own choices. Those choices eventually arrive at their own destination. I shook my head. That sounds poetic, but it does not answer my question. Some questions deserve honesty instead of simplicity. He took one slow step closer but stopped well beyond my personal space. Claire, I cannot decide how other people respond once they see someone's true character. Reputation is fragile because respect cannot be purchased forever. I looked directly into his steel blue eyes. Whether you caused it or not, I do not want my life becoming the reason someone else's falls apart. Something softened in his expression then, not surprise but admiration. As though I had just confirmed something he had quietly hoped was true about me all along. He nodded once, almost to himself. That, he said quietly, is exactly why I chose to remember your name. The evening settled around us with the kind of quiet that only arrived after the city finally grew tired of competing with itself. Boats drifted across the Hudson River, their lights reflected like scattered stars across the dark water. I expected Ethan to defend himself. I expected another carefully measured explanation about influence, reputation, or business. Instead, he looked past me toward the river as though searching for words he had spent years avoiding. When I was 10 years old, he said softly, my mother worked at a hotel not very different from yours. I remained silent. Something in his voice told me this was not a story he shared often. She believed that hard work solved everything. A faint smile appeared for only a second before disappearing. She ironed uniforms after midnight because she wanted them to look perfect. She memorized every guest's favorite drink. She remembered birthdays, anniversaries. She treated strangers with the same kindness she showed her family. His eyes never left the water. One evening, a guest decided to make himself feel important by embarrassing her in front of everyone. My chest tightened. He did not describe the moment in detail. He did not need to. I already understood the silence that followed public humiliation better than I ever wanted to. People laughed, he continued quietly. Others looked away because pretending not to notice was easier than speaking. He drew a slow breath. I was waiting in the lobby after school because she could not afford a babysitter that day. I saw everything. I could suddenly picture a young boy standing alone beneath elegant chandeliers, powerless to change what was happening to the person he loved most. Did anyone help her? I asked. Ethan lowered his eyes for the first time since he had begun speaking. No. The single word carried more weight than an entire explanation. She finished her shift. She smiled at me all the way home. She even made my favorite dinner that night. His voice grew quieter still. After she thought I had fallen asleep, I heard her crying through the apartment wall. The evening breeze lifted the edges of his coat, but he remained perfectly still. That was the night I made myself a promise. If I ever had the ability to protect someone's dignity, I would never stand by pretending I did not see what everyone else had witnessed. I looked at him differently then. Until that moment I had only seen a man surrounded by influence, confidence, and quiet authority. Now I saw the boy who had never forgotten the sound of his mother's tears. Ethan, I said gently, protecting people is not the same as carrying every injustice yourself. He turned toward me, listening without interrupting. You cannot rewrite what happened to her by trying to rewrite every painful moment you encounter. My words lingered between us. He did not argue. He simply absorbed them with the same attention he seemed to give everything that mattered. Maybe not, he admitted after a long silence. But when I saw you kneeling on that ballroom floor, I did not see a stranger. His expression remained calm, yet there was unmistakable honesty behind it. For one impossible second, I saw a memory I promised myself I would never watch happen again. I felt my frustration quietly dissolve, replaced by something far more complicated. Compassion. Because suddenly this had never been about revenge, power, or influence. It had always been about one frightened little boy who had grown into a man still trying to keep a promise he could never make in time for the person who needed it most. Neither of us spoke for several moments after that. The city continued around us as though nothing extraordinary had happened. A ferry crossed the river. Wind rustled through the rose garden. Somewhere behind us, a child laughed before being called home by his parents. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary lives. They reminded me that the world never paused for anyone's pain, no matter how deeply it was felt. I rested my hands against the cool stone railing and watched the current carry scattered reflections downstream. You have been carrying that promise for a very long time, I said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Long enough that I stopped noticing its weight. I turned toward him. Maybe that is the problem. His expression remained thoughtful instead of defensive. Explain. I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully. You believe protecting someone means making sure they never experience another painful moment. But that is impossible. None of us can promise that. He remained silent, listening with the same complete attention that had first unsettled me at the gala. What we can do, I continued, is make sure they do not face those moments alone. There is a difference. His eyes searched mine, not challenging my words but testing them against something inside himself. You think I confuse protection with control? Sometimes. I smiled gently so he would hear kindness instead of criticism. You returned my name badge because it belonged to me. That was protection. You reminded me that my dignity had value. That was kindness. But if every difficult situation disappears before I have the chance to face it myself, then eventually I stop believing in my own strength. Ethan looked down at the river before answering. I never wanted to take your strength away. I know. I believed him completely. But intentions and results are not always the same thing. He let out the faintest breath that almost sounded like a laugh. No one has spoken to me this honestly in years. Maybe everyone else is too impressed by your reputation. And you are not? I smiled. I manage wedding planners, celebrity agents, nervous executives, and 500 impatient guests at a time. You are simply another complicated conversation. For the first time since I had met him, Ethan smiled without restraint. It transformed his entire face, softening years that usually remained hidden behind discipline and careful control. That, he admitted, might be the most accurate description anyone has ever given me. We stood there smiling for only a moment before the seriousness quietly returned. Claire, he said, when I saw you that night, I believed I knew exactly what you needed. And now? He considered the question carefully. Now I think perhaps what you needed most was someone willing to listen before deciding. I nodded. That is all any of us really want. The breeze carried the scent of roses between us once more. It no longer felt like the distance separating two strangers. It felt like space freely chosen instead of imposed. Ethan extended his hand, not to lead me anywhere or ask for anything, but simply as an invitation. After a brief hesitation, I shook it. His grip was steady, respectful, and brief. Thank you, he said quietly. For reminding me that saving someone's future does not erase their past. I looked at him for another second before answering with the one truth I hoped he would never forget. And remembering your past should never keep you from building a better future. The conversation at the conservatory stayed with me long after we walked in opposite directions. For the first time since the gala, I felt lighter. Not because the memory had disappeared, but because someone had finally understood it without trying to rewrite it. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and the familiar rush of hotel life. A national business conference had booked nearly every ballroom, every suite, and every meeting room in the building. My schedule was packed from 7 in the morning until well after sunset. I welcomed the distraction. Busy days left little room for overthinking. Shortly after lunch, however, the atmosphere inside the executive offices shifted. Conversations became quieter. Department heads gathered near conference rooms with concerned expressions. My general manager called an unexpected meeting. We have received several anonymous complaints about the hotel, he explained. Most appear unfounded, but we are reviewing everything carefully. Until then, everyone should remain professional and avoid discussing rumors with guests. Rumors. That single word unsettled me. Luxury hospitality depended on reputation as much as service. False stories could spread through social media faster than facts ever could. The meeting ended, but an uneasy feeling followed me throughout the afternoon. Around 4 o'clock I stepped outside the employee entrance for a brief break. My phone vibrated almost immediately. It was Megan. Claire, where are you? Outside. Come back upstairs. Security is looking for you. My heartbeat quickened. Why? Someone has been asking employees unusual questions about you. I hurried inside. The security supervisor met me near the service elevators with an apologetic expression. Miss Bennett, there is nothing to worry about, but we wanted to make you aware. Earlier today, an individual claiming to represent a media company requested information about your work schedule, your apartment, even whether you usually walked home alone. A chill ran through me despite the warm lobby. Did anyone answer? Absolutely not. He handed me a printed incident report. We documented everything. We simply thought you deserved to know. I thanked him and returned to my office, but concentration became impossible. Someone was no longer interested only in the gala. Someone was interested in me. At exactly 5:30 another message appeared on my phone. This time the sender was not anonymous. Ethan Calloway. Please answer. I hesitated only a second before calling. He picked up immediately. Claire. His voice was calm, but beneath it I sensed unusual urgency. I was just informed about what happened at your hotel. How did you know? People tell me things when they believe they matter. I closed my office door. Security handled it. I know. There was a brief pause before he continued. I also know whoever asked those questions has been contacting other places connected to you. My grip tightened around the phone. Why would anyone do that? Because sometimes wounded pride searches for someone else to blame. Silence settled between us. Finally Ethan spoke again, slower this time. I remember what you told me. Protection is not control. I have thought about those words every day. I waited. So I am not telling you what to do. Another quiet pause followed. I am asking. Please stay at my family estate for a few days until we understand who is asking these questions. You will have complete freedom to leave whenever you choose. If you say no, I will respect your decision. I looked through my office window at employees crossing the lobby below, completely unaware that my ordinary life suddenly felt much less ordinary. For several long seconds I could not answer, because I realized this was the first time Ethan had offered me protection without trying to decide for me. I accepted Ethan's invitation with one condition. I will come because you asked, I told him over the phone. Not because I am afraid. His answer came without hesitation. That is exactly why I hoped you would say yes. An hour later a dark sedan waited outside the employee entrance, but unlike the first mysterious car I had noticed weeks earlier, this one carried no sense of secrecy. The driver introduced himself as Daniel Brooks before opening the rear door with quiet professionalism. During the 40-minute drive north, Manhattan slowly gave way to tree-lined roads and historic estates hidden behind stone walls and towering oaks. I expected towering gates and intimidating displays of wealth. Instead, the Callaway estate resembled an old countryside manor surrounded by gardens that had clearly been loved for generations rather than redesigned to impress strangers. Warm lights glowed through tall windows. Fresh flowers decorated the entrance hall. The house felt lived in instead of displayed. Ethan greeted me himself before I reached the front steps. Welcome, he said simply. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for giving me a choice, I replied. He smiled slightly and led me inside without another word. The staff greeted me politely, never staring, never whispering, never making me feel like an outsider. My guest room overlooked a small lake where ducks drifted peacefully beneath the evening sky. It was beautiful, but what surprised me most was the silence. After years of sirens, traffic, and crowded sidewalks, I had forgotten what quiet actually sounded like. The next morning I wandered downstairs earlier than anyone expected. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen where the aroma of fresh coffee and homemade bread filled the air. Ethan stood near the window wearing a simple gray sweater instead of the perfectly tailored suits I had grown accustomed to seeing. For the first time he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like an ordinary man enjoying a peaceful morning. You are awake early, he observed. Hospitality never sleeps, I answered with a smile. Neither do hotel managers. He laughed softly before pouring another cup of coffee. We spent breakfast discussing ordinary things instead of difficult memories. My parents in Ohio. His love of restoring old books. My dream of eventually directing an entire luxury property. His mother's garden, which still bloomed every spring because he refused to let anyone redesign it. The conversation felt effortless. Around noon, however, Daniel entered the dining room carrying a folder. His expression remained professional, but something had changed. Sir, the attorneys are here. Ethan glanced toward me before looking back at Daniel. Tell them I will meet them in 15 minutes. Daniel nodded and quietly left the room. I stood, assuming breakfast was over. I should probably stay out of your meetings. Ethan hesitated. Normally, yes. He looked at the folder resting on the sideboard before meeting my eyes again. But today's discussion concerns the man from the gala. I believe you deserve to hear the truth. We walked together toward a sunlit library where 3 attorneys waited around a polished oak table covered with documents. They stood respectfully as Ethan entered. One of them immediately began summarizing legal correspondence, reputation disputes, and confidential settlement proposals. Another suggested a far more aggressive response that would almost certainly end the matter quickly. The room fell silent as everyone waited for Ethan's decision. He looked briefly toward me before answering in the calm voice I had come to recognize. No. The attorneys exchanged confused glances. Sir? Ethan folded his hands behind his back. We will not answer humiliation with humiliation. We will respond with facts, professionalism, and patience. Nothing more. I realized then that he had not simply listened to my words beside the river. He had allowed them to change the way he chose to use his influence, and somehow that quiet decision impressed me far more than any display of power ever could. 3 days later I returned to the Grand Regent Hotel. Life had resumed its familiar rhythm, yet something inside me had changed. I no longer walked through the marble lobby wondering whether I belonged there. I knew I did. Confidence did not arrive because someone powerful had noticed me. It arrived because someone had reminded me that my worth had never depended on another person's opinion. News spread quickly that afternoon. The hotel had been selected to host another prestigious charity gala, this one even larger than the previous event. Executives hurried through planning meetings while designers transformed ballrooms with fresh floral displays and elegant lighting. By evening the hotel once again shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, almost identical to the night that had quietly changed my life. I stood near the entrance welcoming guests with the same calm smile I had practiced for years. This time my hands did not shake. This time my heart remained steady. As the ballroom filled, I noticed familiar faces from the previous gala. Business leaders. Philanthropists. Public officials. Then I saw him. The same guest who had humiliated me weeks earlier stepped through the entrance. Conversation softened almost immediately. People recognized him, but something else had changed. The easy confidence he had carried before was gone. He moved through the room receiving polite greetings instead of enthusiastic welcomes. Invitations that once surrounded him now seemed noticeably fewer. I watched quietly from across the ballroom without anger. Whatever had happened during the past weeks had already spoken more clearly than revenge ever could. A few minutes later Ethan entered through another doorway. No dramatic announcement followed him. No crowd rushed to greet him. Yet the atmosphere subtly shifted as people acknowledged his presence with quiet respect. Our eyes met briefly across the ballroom, and he offered nothing more than a small nod before continuing toward another conversation. He was allowing me to stand on my own, exactly as I had asked him to. Near the beginning of the evening the Master of Ceremonies invited several major donors onto the stage to recognize their contributions. To my surprise, the guest who had embarrassed me requested a moment to speak before the program continued. The ballroom grew silent. He looked across the audience before his gaze finally settled on me. Before tonight moves forward, he began carefully, there is something I should have said weeks ago. Every conversation stopped. Every camera lowered. At the last event held in this ballroom, I spoke disrespectfully to a member of this hotel's staff. His voice remained steady, but there was unmistakable humility behind it. My words reflected poor judgment and failed to honor the professionalism she demonstrated. Miss Claire Bennett, I owe you an apology. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me. The silence felt completely different from the silence weeks earlier. Then it had carried embarrassment. Now it carried respect. I walked forward only a few steps, just enough for him to see me clearly. Thank you, I answered simply. I accept your apology, and I hope we both leave tonight remembering that every person in this room deserves the same respect, regardless of their title. For a heartbeat no one moved. Then quiet applause spread across the ballroom until it filled every corner beneath the chandeliers. I glanced toward Ethan. He remained where he stood, saying nothing, claiming nothing, allowing the moment to belong entirely to me. In that instant, I understood the difference between someone who rescues another person and someone who quietly helps them reclaim their own voice. 1 year later, I found myself standing in a ballroom once again, but this time I was not arranging seating charts or reviewing banquet schedules. I was standing behind a podium as the newly appointed director of guest experience for the Grand Regent Hotel, welcoming hospitality professionals from across the country to a conference dedicated to leadership, workplace respect, and service excellence. The chandeliers still sparkled above me. The marble floor still reflected every light in the room. Yet I no longer saw them as symbols of status. They reminded me that beautiful places meant very little if the people inside them forgot how to treat one another with kindness. My parents had flown in from Ohio for the occasion. My younger brother occupied the front row with a smile so proud that it nearly made me laugh. Megan sat beside him, already wiping away tears before I had even begun speaking. Life had changed in ways I never could have imagined, but not because someone rescued me. Life changed because someone believed my dignity deserved to survive one painful evening. After the conference concluded, guests gathered in the garden overlooking the Hudson River for dinner beneath strings of warm lights. Soft music floated through the evening air while conversations replaced formal speeches. I stepped away from the crowd for a quiet moment beside the same roses where Ethan and I had once shared the conversation that changed both of our lives. I heard familiar footsteps behind me before I turned. "You always find this place," Ethan said with a gentle smile. "I think this place found me first," I answered. He stood beside me, looking across the river where the city lights shimmered against the water. For a while neither of us spoke. We no longer needed silence to be filled. Finally I looked toward him and asked the question I had quietly carried for an entire year. "Why did you really remember me?" Ethan smiled, not with mystery this time, but with complete honesty. "Because that night everyone else saw a woman being embarrassed." He turned toward me, his steel blue eyes warmer than I had ever seen them. "I saw someone protecting her own dignity without asking anyone else to do it for her. I knew the world needed more people like that. I simply wanted to make sure you never forgot who you already were." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You spent all that time trying to protect me." "No," he replied. "At first I did." He paused before continuing. "Then you taught me something far more valuable. Real protection is not standing in front of another person forever. It is standing beside them until they remember they can stand on their own." We watched the last colors of sunset disappear beyond the river, comfortable in the quiet that followed. The future remained unwritten, and neither of us tried to define it that evening. Some promises did not require grand declarations. They lived inside ordinary choices repeated every day with patience, respect, and courage. As the lights from the conference glowed behind us and laughter drifted through the gardens, I realized the greatest gift anyone had ever given me was never influence, opportunity, or protection. It was the quiet reminder that another person's opinion could never decide my worth unless I handed them that power. And perhaps that is how every lasting change begins. Not with the loudest voice in the room, but with one person choosing to protect another's dignity, and another choosing to believe that dignity had been theirs all along.